Good morning. My name is Norma Fuentes-Mayorga, and I am a member of the Board of Directors of the Dominican Studies Association. It's a pleasure for me to welcome this panel, to welcome you this morning. We're having a very successful and exciting morning. I hear the panels this morning were very exciting. Welcome all the panelists, and I'm going to introduce Professor George Lipsitz, who is the chair of this panel and who will be introducing the panelists to the audience. Professor George Lipsitz is an emeritus professor of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Among his most notable publications, he has In Subordinate Spaces with Barbara Tomlinson, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, which is a 20th anniversary edition, and a co-edited publication with Kimberly Crenshaw, Luke Harris, and Daniel Hossang, Seeing Race Again. With that said, I yield the panel to Professor Lipsitz, who will be introducing the panelists. Professor Lipsitz.
Well, thanks so much to Professor Fuentes-Mayorga and to the DSA for hosting this convening. We are a group of scholars who first met together in January at a symposium at Harvard, both protesting the denial of tenure to Lorgia Garcia Peña, but also pointing out that that denial marks a moment of conjuncture for Dominican studies and for all studies of social identities and power. We feel that the injury done to Professor Garcia Peña as an individual is also an injury done to scholarship at large, because it evades the importance of Dominican studies as a generative site for the analysis of relations around the whole world. It exposes the flaws in the ways in which traditional scholarship is done, even at elite institutions, where nations, continental nations, are seen as important, and islands and archipelagos are seen as unimportant. And yet the work of Professor Garcia Peña and the work of the ethnic studies, feminist studies, and Dominican studies scholars on this panel show at this point it is indispensable for people who love freedom, for people who love justice, for people who want to refuse the unlivable destinies being meted out to displace and dispossess people all around the world, to confront the rich body of knowledge that exists within Dominican studies. And so this is a continuation of that panel in January. It's part of ongoing political work, not only to secure tenure for Professor Garcia Peña, but to establish Dominican studies as a centrally important framework in all of the institutions in which we work. Some of the scholars on the panel today and some of the participants in January have contributed to a special issue of the journal Calfu, published by Temple University Press. This will be in print soon. It's volume 7, number 2. It's a special issue about Lorgia Garcia Peña and the broader importance of Dominican studies to people all around the world. So we want to go in a particular order. We have experts in ethnic studies, feminist studies, Dominican studies, many other areas. We're going to start with Professor Lourdes Torre, and then we'll move to Professor Laura Briggs, Professor Ginnetta Candelario, and Professor Elizabeth Manley. So I'm going to turn it over to Lourdes Torre, and if there's time left at the end, I'll make some summary comments. But we want to, again, express our gratitude for being able to present this work here, and also to indicate that Dominican studies is important, not just to people with particular experiences and embodied identities, but it is an indispensable framework for understanding how things work in the world, how we're actually governed, how we might yet have some decent and democratic futures. So let me turn it over to Professor Torres.
Thank you. Thank you, Norma, for being here today and getting us going, and George for submitting this panel and giving us the opportunity to meet here with colleagues and friends and talk about this work. So as George said, I participated in the symposium on Lorgia Garcia Peña's scholarship in Boston in January. And it was really wonderful to be there. It was great to have a space to celebrate Lorgia's significant contributions to Dominican studies to ethnic studies, and also to be there with her colleagues, her students and colleagues from around the country who were there to protest the grossly unfair tenure decision that Harvard made. So I'll talk a little bit about the same things that I discussed at that setting. And basically, what I wanted to do was to briefly touch upon some of the contradictory factors at play in our fields of study in terms of this issue of the legitimacy of ethnic studies that still plagues the advancements of our field. And when discussing ethnic studies, I am referencing all the fields we usually consider under that rubric, including but not only Latino studies, Black studies, Caribbean studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies. And so what I'll do is comment briefly about what I see as these contradictory forces playing out in terms of the institutionalization of the field of ethnic studies within the university, and relatedly in terms of the dissemination of the research that's produced by ethnic studies scholars. In both cases, the point is that we can't lose sight of the need to continue to articulate the importance of our work and to fight against narrow and untrue conceptions of what is our ethnic studies projects and what they contribute. So much has changed in ethnic studies since those early days in the 60s and 70s, when student activists demanded courses and programs in ethnic studies and Black studies, Chicano studies, and Puerto Rican studies. On the one hand, we now have a proliferation of ethnic studies courses, of programs and departments across the nation. And this reflects the beginning of the institutionalization of ethnic studies in universities. On the other hand, at the same time, just as some of these programs are beginning to take off and grow, in other sites, the programs are being dismantled, downsized, and consolidated or eliminated as universities respond to both the economic retrenchment and the ultra-right climate that we're currently experiencing in our country. Clearly, in many sites, even those with a long history of ethnic studies, in times of retrenchment, when perceived educational instrumentality and neoliberal priorities are at the forefront of what's driving our universities, questions about the legitimacy of ethnic studies are going to surface. The marginalization of these programs and the scholarship we produce is a national phenomenon. And as we know, the objections to our programs usually have to do with some variation of one of the following: that our programs lack academic rigor, that we focus on grievances and foster resentment and anger, that ethnic studies only focuses on particularized bodies of knowledge, that it promotes navel gazing and has no relevance to anyone outside of some minority group. And more that ethnic studies doesn't prepare students for the future. It's not going to get them jobs. Ethnic studies scholars argue, in fact, that offering particularized knowledge, that rather than offering particularized knowledge, our programs and curricula offer an important corrective to what the National Education Association calls, quote, Euro-American ethnic studies, end quote. In other words, the majority of the curriculum students are exposed to throughout most of their education, which normalizes the perspective of the dominant group and implicitly or explicitly promotes white supremacy. Arguably, the greatest value of ethnic studies is its commitment toward ensuring the dissemination of subjugated knowledges. Subjugated knowledges, a phrase coined by Michel Foucault, refers to the ways of knowing that have been ignored or marginalized by the dominant culture. Centering scholarship based on knowledges that have been disregarded or trivialized is one of the projects of ethnic studies. We center the lives, histories, struggles, theories, and knowledges of subjugated populations whose realities, contributions, and impact have been erased or whitewashed in much of mainstream curriculum. Ethnic studies programs also reject the notion that there can be such a thing as a colorblind scholarship. Through our ethnic studies research and teaching, we explore the politics of knowledge production, specifically which knowledges are unquestionably endorsed and what ways of knowing are considered as an afterthought, if at all. This is a project that expands and enriches all of the humanities, the social sciences, and the hard sciences. Centering subjugated knowledges has become increasingly important, especially at this juncture when we're living in through a time of heightened racial tensions that is directly connected to anxieties about the perceived diminishing importance of white privilege. Students profit from getting a critical perspective about the historical roots of inequality, how these roots are part of the very foundation of our nation, and in fact, as Ibram Kendi reminds us, have been stamped from the beginning. They also profit from an understanding of the transgenerational trauma and lasting effects of the oppression on marginalized groups in society today. That the demographic makeup of the country and the college-bound population is shifting can no longer be ignored. Already in many cities across the country, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and multiracial people make up the majority of American school children. While 45% of all undergraduates are people of color, the percentage of faculty of color that greet them in college is less than 24%. Nationally, even fewer people of color are tenured full professors, since 81% of these positions are held by white professors. As theologian Miguel del Torre reminds us, quote, academic institutions that disregard our country's changing demographics and ignore the questions and concerns that students of color bring to our institutions may end up losing their relevance for this emerging majority of university students, end quote. It seems that each year we're protesting yet another unfair tenure decision, writing letters, expressing outrage. Again and again, universities hire, exploit, and then spit out people of color, and then begin the cycle all over again. As Trevor C. Ellison recently noted, commenting on a tenure decision, a denial of tenure of faculty of color at Dartmouth, quote, universities don't have a diversity problem. Rather, the temporary, precarious, and disavowed labor of people of color at universities is their purposeful and intentional diversity solution, end quote. What I suggest is that one way of making our engagement with diversity more meaningful would be by working to center subjugated knowledges in our universities, first by hiring and tenuring skillful faculty of color doing this work, and then by providing resources to expand and strengthen the departments and programs that are already engaged in this project, and finally by integrating this approach across the curriculum. Our programs also have the expertise and knowledge to address the racial and intersecting inequities and injustices boiling over within our universities and the US. So universities should recognize this and draw upon our expertise and build upon it. The best of our ethnic studies projects, beautifully exemplified by Loria Garcia Peña's scholarship, embodies a critical ethnic studies approach that analyzes systems of power and inequity and promotes transformative practices in scholarship and community engagement. This approach is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and intersectional. Its focus is local, transnational, and global. It's at the core of the conversations we need to be having about how to address the problems of inequity, systemic racism, sustainability, and all the other challenges that are facing the US and beyond. It is a critical ethnic studies grounded in the decolonial, anti-racist feminist movements that gave impetus to ethnic studies and continues to inform its development. The best of this work is intersectional and anchored in comparative, relational, and global frameworks that can most effectively deconstruct racism, colonialism, and imperialism. The best scholars like Lourdes Peña and Garcia are committed to developing new analytic paradigms and languages which are not bound by national or regional borders. It is specifically this work that resists the institutionalization and co-optation of our field. As our panelists will explore in greater detail, Lourdes Garcia Peña's work helps us rethink concepts like Latinidad, Blackness, race, and ethnicity, and to situate them within a transnational and global perspective. Lourdes is very much interested in relational formations of race. Her work asks us to consider the racialization and formation of Dominican and Haitian identities in relation to one another, as well as in relation to colonial power structures. This makes sense since racialization is best understood as a relational project, and racial constructions are formed not only in relation to whiteness, but in relation to other marginalized groups. Lourdes demonstrates how the construction of race is a mutually constitutive process. From this type of analysis, we learn how subordinated groups are differently positioned and how inclusion and exclusion are dynamic and shifting processes, varying in accordance to the underlying logic of the colonial power structure. In the conclusion of her brilliant book, The Borders of Dominicanidad, Lourdes humbly notes, quote, "I am hopeful that the work I want my book to do, to shatter silences and uncover other archives of knowledge, will get us closer to a dialogue about the ways in which scholarship can dismantle the intellectual legacy sustaining systems of oppression," end quote. In fact, Lourdes Garcia Peña's research, teaching, and activism compellingly contest the anti-Black and anti-immigrant forces we are struggling with today and help us imagine new creative ways to disrupt these dynamics. This is exactly the promise of a critical ethnic studies and what the best of our scholarship can offer. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Lipsitz, you said who is the next panelist in your order?
That would be me.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Torres. It's an honor to be on this panel and part of this conference with its deeply important theme of the urgency of Dominican and ethnic studies in the present hour. And I want to thank George Lipsitz for organizing us as a panel. Those of us who work in Dominican and ethnic studies, whoops, I'm sorry. I just let someone into the room and totally got lost. Thank you. Sorry. Those of us who work in Dominican and ethnic studies are accustomed to seeing people's work undervalued, to seeing people passed over for jobs, grants, fellowships, tenure and promotion, even as individuals are periodically targeted by the right-wing extremists who use online platforms to organize virtual mobs that flood inboxes and Twitter feeds with insults, death threats, and doxing. One has to be twice as good to be seen, though the opportunity to work in a field bursting with brilliant people that is so important to students and speaks to all the major crises, questions of justice, and cleavages of the world more than makes up for it. But against this backdrop of normative devaluation, and we all know good scholars who've been denied tenure, the Ivy League attracts particular attention because, well, rich alums. And so in the past few years, the grinding daily crises of people in ethnic studies in US universities has played out on a larger stage. First, at Yale, Albert Laguna, the scholar of Cuban America, was denied tenure despite the fact that he had written an award-winning book exploring the politics of the relationship between the people of the island and the Cuban American community through popular culture. The shock that students and faculty felt at the tenure denial in what should have been a slam dunk case was joined to the scandal of the second-class treatment of Yale's program in ethnicity, race, and migration, a huge major with basically no faculty lines, whose inability to weigh in on Laguna's case undoubtedly had an effect on the tenure denial. Fortunately, senior scholars associated with this program and others found an effective voice by essentially threatening a strike, withdrawing volunteer labor in ethnic studies until the institutional problems were addressed and Laguna was given a fair hearing. Students, scholars, alums, and people from around the country also put pressure on Yale. And though the struggle was long and its outcome was uncertain for quite some time, they ultimately won lines for the program, and Albert Laguna's case was reconsidered, and he was ultimately granted the tenure that he deserved. Harvard, unfortunately, was a different story. One of its up-and-coming young stars, Dominican studies scholar Lourdes Torre, was denied tenure despite the publication of her award-winning book, The Borders of Dominicanidad, Race, Nation, and the Archives of Contradiction, as well as an edited collection, and with two other books largely completed, Teaching for Freedom, Community as Rebellion, and a second, Translating Blackness, Migrations and Detours of Latinx Colonialities and Global Perspectives, with 12 peer-reviewed articles and chapters published, and a robust number of op-eds and other writing for general audiences. For those of you who don't habitually spend a lot of time evaluating tenure and promotion dossiers, let me just say that at most Research One universities, this would not just be sufficient for tenure, it would earn a scholar promotion to full professor. I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about The Borders of Dominicanidad, partly because it's a path-breaking book that deserves our attention, and partly because we can think with it to identify what's wrong with Harvard and its relationship not only to Dominican studies or ethnic studies, but also more broadly to how it institutionally thinks about US empire, anti-Blackness, and Hispanidad. That is because Borders of Dominicanidad is a book about the vanishing of the Dominican Republic in relationship to our conversations about US imperialism, Latinidad, gender meanings, and Blackness. If we needed any confirmation about the institutional invisibility of the Dominican Republic in too many elite US universities, we got it in Garcia Peña's tenure denial. But as Lourdes Garcia Peña says in the book, fiercely pushing back against this normative silencing and the way it's used to produce a US racism, this book is my way to respond to the growing anti-immigrant and anti-Black violence devastating our present world, just as we at this conference are using this space to say no to that violence and to refuse that erasure. For me, as a scholar of US empire, the Caribbean, gender studies, and Latinx studies, this book was mind-blowing and eye-opening. Despite years of thinking about and even living in the Dominican Republic for a year, I had somehow managed to not think the thought that this book so centrally brings to our attention, which is that the Haiti-Dominican Republic border is inside the United States, as Lourdes Garcia Peña puts it, or rather that the way this border is imagined in the DR and the US is at least in part a product of US empire. Any number of scholars, Sybil Fisher, Laurent Dubois, Mary Renda, and Michelle Rolfe-Trio, have asked us to consider that Haiti was important to ideologies about slavery and Blackness in the US. And that case seems relatively settled. The Haitian Revolution roiled slave owners in the US, underscoring the threat in the southern United States of a mass uprising of enslaved people where they were a numerical majority. The Haitian Republic also resulted in tens of thousands of Haiti's slave owners coming to the United States, some bringing enslaved African and African-descended people with them. The US occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934 shaped ideas of race, gender, and empire, and scholar Aaron Durbin would add sexuality in the United States. What Borders of Dominicanidad invites us to think about is the other side of Hispaniola and the US occupation there from 1916 to 1924, or arguably until 1941, and then again in 1965, and how much the stories about what the Marines were doing there relied on and reproduced a dichotomous view of the island, the fundamentally absurd insistence that there were Black Haitians on one side of the border and Mestizo Dominicans on the other. Garcia Peña reminds us that this binary view that excluded Dominican Blackness was not just produced through the racist stories of the Criollo elites in the Dominican Republic. The US Marines and the colonial occupation government did not just produce violence and victimization, it also, to paraphrase Garcia Peña, produced stories. The US occupation criminalized Dominican Blackness. The Marines killed Afro-Dominican religious figure Alivorio Mateo, or Papa Liborio, disrupted the ceremonies of the confradias, and seized religious items like drums and rum. We can understand the ongoing criminalization of Afro-Dominican religious ceremonies in the US and the island with their queer and female leadership as dating to the US occupation of the DR. The Borders of Dominicanidad shows us how, again and again, the production of this border and these oppositions had long roots that reached to the US, which resulted in the criminalization of and refusal of Dominican Blackness. So to take only one among many examples Garcia Peña offers us, when the earthquake of 2010 devastated Haiti, we found US writers producing the border all over again, commenting on Haiti's deforestation, Blackness, poverty, and voodoo or voodoo, as if they somehow caused the earthquake, as against a Dominican landscape they characterized as prosperous, Catholic, verdant, and mestizo. From the 19th century to last week, we see again and again how this border was produced in the US racial and national imaginary as much as on the island. This book also offers an important intervention into gender studies, helping us see how the association of womanhood with the nation runs through Hispaniola and produces a familiar narrative about sexuality and dangerous Black men. In particular, Garcia Peña retells the story of the Galindo family, including their 3 young daughters who were murdered in an act of banditry in 1822. Although the men were convicted of the murders were all light-skinned Spanish speakers, 3 decades later, the story was rewritten to make the children virgins raped by Haitian soldiers. It was a move designed to consolidate a Dominican consensus around the idea that its real Independence Day, its real national founding and national myth was freedom from Haiti, which occurred 22 years later in 1844. The Haitian unification of the island from 1822 to 1844 was possible for a variety of reasons, including that Haiti freed enslaved people in the region then known as Spanish Haiti, and thus it won the widespread support of Black Dominicans, even as the burden of France's demand for money reparations for its lost colonial investment in Haiti forced the young nation to impose onerous taxes on the Criollo landowners. But high taxes was not as great a story as raped virgins. And so the founding national myth of the Dominican Republic was produced through a narrative of gender, in which the former Spanish colony took its leave of a cruel and inhumanly vicious Haitian occupation made possible by the disloyalty of Black Dominicans, who were thus symbolically cast out of national identity. The occupation also brought another ugly gendered legacy: rape and other kinds of sexual violence by soldiers, sex work, and as in Puerto Rico, the association of women who did sex work with venereal disease, understanding them as carriers and US soldiers as innocents victimized by them. Even as US historians have made the occupation of the DR a footnote, these stories appeared in the work of Dominican novelists where they were remembered. Garcia Pena and the Borders of Dominicanidad also insists that we understand the centrality of US political, economic, and military expansion in Hispaniola to the production of Latinx as a US racial category. As we all know, Latin America and the United States share a common New World history as a place where indigenous African and European peoples met each other, and the legacy of those encounters, their violence, sexual assault, commercial and other relations of inequality, and their love and intimacy is represented in all of our bodies. That is, those we consider more or less white or native or Black are spread across the Americas. So how exactly did we come to consider the mestizo as a racial type that we equate with Latinx in the United States? The answer, of course, runs through Mexico and the rest of Latin America, in part through the writing of and nation formation work of criollos throughout the region. But how exactly was mestizaje instantiated in the United States as a racial formation accompanied by the force of anti-Blackness? This too can be understood in relationship to the DR. The location of Afro-Dominicans, or better, Africanness, is outside the Dominican Republic. That the location of Blackness is really Haiti, is really outside Latinidad. Garcia Pena points us to the example of the 1937 mass murder, the slaughter of 20,000 ethnic Haitians and members of border populations, the Rayanos, under Trujillo with machetes and knives, by his military, organized and professionalized by the US Marines. Bordering Dominicanidad points to the frequency with which the US historiography of this event characterizes it as an anti-Haitian campaign and one of the most important events in the history of Dominican-Haitian relations. But it was a slaughter of the Dominican Republic's own people, not Haitians. Or more recently, after the earthquake, an image of Sonia Marmolejos figured as a Dominican woman volunteering to nurse Haitian babies in the Dario Contreras Hospital in Santo Domingo as a sentimental way of understanding the newly opened border between the two nations, the palpable easing of anti-Haitian sentiment, the material aid provided by the Dominican Republic. But in figuring her as a remarkable person doing an almost unthinkably generous thing, the national and international press managed to forget that Marmolejos was another Rayano, another member of a mixed, mobile, transnational border population engaged in the commonplace sharing of caring labor, of nursing each other's babies, without taking anything away from her compassion and kindness. It's possible to notice that exceptionalizing this mundane act of mutual aid contributed to insisting on the absolute difference of Dominicans and Haitians. Through these and many other narratives, Lourdes Garcia Pena shows us Blackness is located outside of and away from Dominicanness, from Latinidad. The racism and xenophobia of this moment in the United States, in the Dominican Republic, in the world, the glorification of sexual violence, the celebration of a truly ugly masculinity through police that shoot even Black children, or presidents who are accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault is terrifying and revolting. And make no mistake, the decision to deny tenure to a gifted and brilliant scholar like Lourdes Garcia Peña is of a piece with this ugliness. But this book, the field of Dominican studies, and the work of ethnic studies writ large signal our refusal of this violence, misogyny, racism, and xenophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Briggs. I'm not certain if Professor Lipsitz would like to introduce the other panelists.
Yeah, well, the next speaker is Professor Ginnetta Candelario.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Share, because I do have a slideshow. Can you all see that?
Yes.
So I want to, of course, thank George Lipsitz for organizing this panel, Norma, Fuentes-Mayorga, and the other organizers of the DSA for all the, I know, really labor-intensive and difficult logistical labor involved in pulling something like this off. And I want to thank my earlier panelists, Lourdes and Laura, for these wonderful preliminary earlier presentations. So what I offered to do was to reprise a version of the comments I made at Lourdes' event in Harvard in January as well. At that moment, I was really trying to convey to Lourdes that she is not and has not been alone in her labors in Dominican studies and Black studies, Latino studies, women and gender studies, et cetera, and that in fact she's part of a long legacy of Afro-descended, Black identified, and otherwise Dominican feminist women working in the fields of education, higher education, and in the United States. So that it was clear to her, I hope, that she's part of a long continuity. For my comments today, though, following the suggestions made by the panel conveners, I wanted to telescope out a little bit from Lourdes' case specifically to offer the example of the research that actually my co-panelist, Beth Manley, my longtime collaborator, April Mays, who I know is with us here today, and I have been doing for over a decade, now 20 years in my case, of compiling the history of feminism in the DR as an example of how centering the Dominican Republic, which Silvio Torres Sarian has called the cradle of Blackness in the Americas, that's the title of my talk, gives us really important perspectives and paradigm shifts in thinking about American studies, women's studies, ethnic studies, area studies, etc. So that is what I will be talking about today. Let's see, here we go. So yesterday I taught on Thursday, I taught my final class of a new course I've been teaching called Caribbean Feminisms. One of the students put together a beautiful art piece that was a refiguring of a map in which they literally recentered the whole Caribbean in the center of the globe, because that is what they have learned in the course of a semester, learning about feminisms that emerged from the Caribbean. I wanted to include their map here, but couldn't download it quickly enough. So this map is one that captures, for me, what happens when you think from the Caribbean in terms of your understanding about not only the history of the hemisphere and our hegemon, the United States, but also, of course, the history of Western imperialism and coloniality more generally. This is the model that drives the work that I have been doing for 20 years, beginning with my first book, Black Behind the Ears, which was the genesis of that next project on trying to historicize feminism in the DR. And this collection, I know many of the folks who are in the room with us today have seen this already, but this is the collection that Beth Manley, April Mays, and I put together that includes 1,500 pages of primary documents of Dominican feminist history dating from 1865 to 1965. And it is a tiny, tiny percentage of the actual many thousands of pages that the three of us, just as three scholars, not counting the other dozen or so scholars who are now doing this work, documenting and historicizing and analyzing feminisms in the DR. This is just a tiny sampling of that. And in the course of doing that, as was the case with all three of ours other work, April's on the Mulatto Republic, Beth's on the Paradox of Paternalism, what becomes clear time and again is that not only is feminism autochthonous to the Dominican Republic, but that it played a role in the development of feminist and women's movements, as well as anti-racist movements and anti-imperialist movements, labor movements, etc., throughout the world, but especially in the United States and Europe. One of the things that is often surprising to my students and to folks when I give this talk in more university settings is that Dominican women called themselves and considered themselves feminists well before they considered themselves suffragists or were even concerned with pursuing suffrage. And this is unique and distinctive and bears acknowledging because it tells us something about the kind of cutting edge visions that they had and the much more global, both in the sense of ample, but also in terms of worldwide, that they had of women's political emancipation and participation, economic interests, etc. Because suffrage itself was limited to a particular context that did not obtain in the DR. So part of the work has been documenting the stories of women like Socorro del Rosario Sanchez, who was one of the first women people really in the Dominican Republic to pursue funding and establishment of secular education for girls and in general in a country that previously had been reliant almost entirely on the Catholic Church for formal education. Socorro del Rosario Sanchez was a Black identified woman, the sister of one of the so-called founding fathers of the nation, Francisco del Rosario Sanchez. And she is often left out of the story of feminism and or education in the Dominican Republic. Some have claimed precisely because she was a Black identified woman, self-identified and other identified as Black. She established the Colegio Corazón de María in 1870 in Santiago de los Caballeros. She subsequently established the Colegio de Altagracia in 1875, Escuela Superior de Señoritas in 1878, and she was one of the first people to establish a professional degree in pharmacy for women in the Dominican Republic in the 1880s. She was also a very active journalist and writer. And this again is history that is often left out of the story, largely because of her racial identification. This was part of the precursor to what becomes the liberal and civic feminisms of the Second Republic in the Dominican Republic, led by folks like Gregorio Luperón, Eugenio María de Hostos, and the woman who we are more familiar with, Salomé Ureña de Enríquez, who is often the figurehead that is profiled and most commended as part of this story, in large part because she was considered and identified as a mulata woman as opposed to as a Black woman, and because she married into a white identified elite family, Los Enrique Carvajals, who came from Curacao and were of Curaçaoan Jewish descent. I'm not going to take too much time in going over these biographies, but the point being that women's education, and particularly education as the vehicle for civic engagement and the development of civil society, was a founding agenda and vision of feminists in the Dominican Republic. And importantly, they called themselves that. The word feminist was established was developed in Paris, in France specifically, in the 1880s, initially intended as a pejorative term, for women who had been organizing and agitating in France since the French Revolution for their citizenship rights, and meant to tar them with the brush of being emasculating harridans who were trying to feminize men and masculinize women. Not surprisingly, as often happens in these cases, those French women embraced the term and reconfigured it to actually articulate their political agenda of parity and equality and equity in the political, economic, social, and cultural realms. The word made its way fairly quickly from Paris, from France, to the Caribbean and to Latin America, precisely because of the pan-Antillean nature of Caribbean organizing against slavery, the abolition of slavery, for example, in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and against US imperialism in the Dominican Republic and throughout the Americas, which is becoming increasingly clear in this late 19th century moment. So women in the Dominican Republic begin to call themselves publicly, both in the national press, but also in their international contributions to press media throughout the Americas, but also even in terms of public culture. So this image here is of a woman named Virginia Elena Ortega, who was part of the educated elite of Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic, who in 1899 put on this zarzuela, which is basically an operetta, in the central plaza of Puerto Plata, in this building right here, which is called La Goleta, which literally was facing the cathedral, the city hall, the treasury, and so forth, all the major entities of Puerto Plata. The play was called Las Feministas, and the entire point of it was questioning the institution of marriage as being inherently harmful and disadvantageous to women. Now, this is a radical thing to argue in a Catholic country in front of the cathedral and the institutions of the state. But it was very much of a piece with the fact that in that same year, the Dominican Republic legalized divorce, including divorce initiated by women, right? So that was an incredibly progressive and radical vision of what kinds of agendas would improve women's life chances, both domestically and publicly. And it was exceptional. That was not happening in the United States. It's that context in which one of the women whose work I'm most interested in documenting and have been working on 20 years, compiling a biography for, is Mercedes Mota, who was raised in Puerto Plata, became part of this feminist school teacher circuit, and was ultimately selected by the Secretary of State at the time, Francisco Enrique Carvajal, who was Salome's husband, to represent the Dominican Republic at the Buffalo World's Fair, also known as the Pan American Exposition, which was requested by the ICW, which was having its second meeting at the Buffalo World's Fair. And this is the International Council of Women, who are white suffragists, as you all probably know, and who were gathering at the Pan Am to pursue their suffrage agenda. The Pan Am, as I'm sure you all know, was a celebration of US imperialism. It was literally meant to showcase the United States taking of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam, as well as other former Spanish territories. And the ICW viewed this as an opportunity to promote their suffrage agenda in an international context at home in Buffalo. In doing that, they once again triggered the ire of Black club women, who had been organizing in the aftermath of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and racist and lynching violence, women who were part of the founding of the Niagara movement, which, as you again probably know, is the precursor to the NAACP, women like Mary Talbert and Mary Church Terrell, who were also members of the ICW, but routinely found themselves excluded from spaces like the meeting at the Pan Am. Who was included, though, were, this was Mary Talbert at the Phyllis Wheatley Club in Buffalo, which organized to protest the exclusion of women, of Black women from the ICW's events. I'm going to come back to Sarah Miranda, actually. Who was included and invited to speak, though, was this woman, Mercedes Mota, who was a Puerto Plata school teacher and who was a childhood friend of Salome and Pedro and Francisco's son, Pedro Ricureña. Mercedes spoke at the fair. She was one of only 4 women who the ICW offered to give a public talk from Latin America. Her comments were reported throughout the Buffalo press. And a large part of what she did, as was the case with subsequent Dominican feminists in these international fora, was to decry and critique US imperialism and to document the fact that Dominican women had been organizing for their political, economic, cultural, and citizenship rights since the Second Republic, since 1865 and beyond. So you have a situation then in which the agenda always was both domestic, international, transnational, and transatlantic. But it's not until the US occupation of 1916 that we see the organization of a formal institution known as the Comité Central Feminista Dominicano, which was established by Petronila Angelica Gomez, an Afro-descended Black identified woman of humble descent, not from a landed family at all, but one of the beneficiaries of that feminist school teacher network that was initiated right around the time of her birth in the 1880s, that expanded throughout the country. And Petronila quickly became part of a larger international network that was established by Elena Arizmendi Mejia, who was a Mexican feminist, revolutionary nationalist, a consort to Vasconcelos, who attended the 1922 conference organized by the League of Women Voters, and was horrified to see that the white suffragists of the United States pretended to lead Latin American women in the pursuit of their rights. And we're not aware that, in fact, Latin American women like Petronila and Mercedes and Socorro and Salome had already been organizing for many decades before them, pursuing their rights. Another woman I want to mention very quickly, Evangelina Rodriguez Peroso, who was the first Dominican woman licensed to practice medicine in the DR. She herself was again a beneficiary of this feminist network of school teachers who expanded throughout the country, increasing literacy and inculcating a kind of social welfare, civic society ethos, one that she practiced to the end of her life, which was a result of violence on the part of the Trujillato. Just last week, Beth and I gave a talk in honor of the anniversary of the murder of the Mirabal sisters, the Patria, Minerva and Maria Teresa. And I pointed out there that these women were born right in this moment of the formalization of feminism in the DR, and that the reason they became the activists that they became was precisely because of these precursors, these earlier feminist efforts, agendas, and accomplishments. This is the woman who is most often identified with feminism in the DR of the 20th century. It is no coincidence that she is a white woman who spent a large part of her formative years and young adult life in Spain, and that she returned to the Dominican Republic once the US occupation ended and immediately stepped into the public limelight and displaced women like Petronila Angelica Gomez, like Evangelina, who were Black identified and from more humble means in the public discourse and conversation. And that in fact, she was part of what comes to be a collaboration with the Dominican state around institutionalizing the feminist agendas that the precursors from the late 19th century and early 20th century had been pursuing, agendas around maternal and child health, public education, etc., and property rights and marital rights and divorce rights around patria potestad, for example. A common theme, and again, I'm just going to wrap quickly, in all these cases is that in what Dominican women were present in every international gathering, beginning with the Buffalo World's Fair gathering of the ICW that occurred throughout the 20th century. Not only were they present, they often played prominent and notable roles, almost every time becoming one of the public speakers given the podium in these contexts. Even when perhaps there were only 3 slots, almost always there was a Dominican woman. Another case in point is Plinta Vocerical, who was one of the 4 women who spoke at the 1928 meeting of the Pan-American Union in Havana, at which the IACW was founded. Camila Enrique Ureña, again, Salome's daughter, as many of you might know, was born in the DR, but was raised in Cuba and was part of the Cuban feminist movement and moved from there to the United States to Vassar. It's in this moment, by the way, that you have the rise, and I'm going to wrap here because Beth, I think, is going to pick this up for us, of the feminism that is the turning point in the DR, to the extent that it becomes identified with negative figures such as Minerva de Nardino, who was very much a Trujillista state feminist, who through a series of underhanded activities positioned herself to be the director of the IACW, a position which she held for nearly 20 years, and through which she promoted the interests of the Trujillato. Now, why is all this relevant to the conversation today? I'll say that in closing, it's relevant because what we see is that in all of these cases, Dominican feminist issues of various kinds, women's education, citizenship, civil participation, anti-imperialism, economic development, et cetera, were involved in these larger international conversations and in conversation with US organizers and organizations, ranging from the NAACP and Black Club Women to the IACW, the Pan American Union, et cetera. And it is a history that is far too often unacknowledged, and contributions that are still to be identified and recognized appropriately. And that's the work that Lourdes has been doing, that's the work that I'm doing, that's the work that many of us in Dominican studies are and have been doing, to the benefit, I think, of all the disciplines that our work touches upon. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Candelario.
Our next speaker is Professor Elizabeth Manley.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's my pleasure to be able to present today, and a distinct honor to be on this panel with such incredible panelists. I'm particularly grateful to DSA for all the organizational work that went into making this possible, making it happen in the current climate, such as it is, and to George Lipsitz's generous leadership, both in this panel and in editing the special issue of CalFU that will appear shortly around Lourdes Garcia Peña's work and the case for Dominicanidad. I am very excited for the chance to reflect here, and this is going to reflect some of my comments back in January, of the importance of Hispaniola and Dominican studies viewed through Lourdes Garcia Peña's work for you all, but also to think around George's question or proposal that Dominican studies is this crucial nexus and generative site for the larger questions that we should be asking as scholars of the humanities, right, of life, of the human experience. In the introduction to her 2016 book, The Borders of Dominicanidad, Lourdes Garcia Peña argues, as many of us who work in Dominican and Caribbean studies and other fields find ourselves doing, that her work brings the concept of Dominicanidad from the footnote to the center of the page. Through her scholarship, pedagogy, and activism, Garcia Peña has fought for a centering of Dominicans and Dominican studies, Dominicanidad, and the island of Hispaniola itself in larger scholarly and public imaginations, particularly in the aftermath of Harvard's intellectually marginalizing decision to deny tenure to Garcia Peña, as well as the other denials and marginalizations that Laura Briggs talks about. Her work continues to remind us what we risk losing by not engaging with her set of intertwined practices of centering. She implores us to address the Dominican footnote condition, but also to think about how this condition afflicts other areas of study. For me, the place of Hispaniola in the footnote has always been a bit baffling. I fail to see how an island that sits at the center of a set of core scholarly questions, historical and contemporary, about race and nation, colonization and sovereignty, race and gender, and identity and belonging, could be so summarily ignored, both in academia as a whole and in these particular decisions of late. As a historian, my key concerns here revolve around the ways Garcia Peña has helped highlight the relevance of the Dominican Republic's historical narrative to central concerns of my discipline and other disciplines, but also the ways that history underscores the significant place of Dominican studies in a more inclusive, interdisciplinary, and pedagogically grounded approach to our collective past and presence in the university, in the nation state, and around the globe. For many of us engaged in the study of Hispaniola, this work of centering footnotes is a primary and necessary mission. We are often asked to demonstrate why the Dominican Republic or Haiti matter, or how they relate to the Americas or to the world more broadly. While I don't necessarily dispute this as an editorial practice, as it helps expand our work to more encompassing audiences and to sort of make this claim, I often resist its inference writ large and want to ask why US or European historians don't have to defend their geographical choices. Isn't our work as scholars supposed to point up or upend existing hierarchies of knowledge and significance? Shouldn't we long ago have discarded such arcane and reductive ideas of importance, particularly relative to size? Shining a spotlight on the place where the identities of the Americas post-encounter were first forged through forced labor, colonial imprints of hierarchy and Christianizing missions, and later through imperialism, elite and authoritarian control, and migration, demonstrates how this very place is crucial to an entire hemispheric understanding of these very same ideas, regardless of its small size, or perhaps paradoxically because of it. On this very small island, and through the study of its people and their diasporic circuits, we can better answer many of these Americas-wide post-contact and decolonial questions. I argue that it is intellectually and pedagogically crucial that we stop allowing Hispaniola and its diaspora to be allocated such a marginalized place in academia, and more broadly speaking as well, and point to the ways that we can use Garcia Peña's work on the page and embodied to think about a more holistic understanding of its scholarly impact. In my larger piece that will be in this CalFUB issue, I focus on 4 main interventions of her work, as well as its reflections in the expanding literature of Hispaniola and transnational Hispaniola. Here, I'm going to just briefly touch on each of the 4, but there is kind of so much more to say around each of these issues, and there are more issues. I'm kind of just pointing to 4 of them. First, before doing that, though, I want to take this opportunity to reassert that one disavowal of a person's work, even if a loud one, does not define how we as a community see that person and the work they have done or the impact of their intellectual labors on the contours of the field. And I think our presence here reaffirms that. But it should, however, serve as a clarion call to reassess certain hierarchies of knowledge that continue to marginalize on all levels of the academy. I think the fact that I've known Lourdes Garcia Peña since the very earliest points in our careers colors what I have to say here, and I think it should, right? What we put on the page is only a portion of what we do. The rest is very much in the flesh. How we engage with our students and our colleagues, how we interact within the academic community, how we link our ideas to praxis. This all matters so very much, and it often becomes obfuscated in the moments in academia in which we attempt to situate individuals in often arcane intellectual categories and rubrics. I believe that it is crucial that we emphasize here that all the kinds of work we do as scholars matters to the future of the academy, our students, and our colleagues, regardless of the decision of a single institution, and that Lourdes Garcia Peña's work should be used to point to a better, more engaged direction of praxis. So returning to those 4 points in Lourdes Garcia Peña's work, first, I believe her work points up the ways in which the historiography of Hispaniola reminds us viscerally of the uses and abuses of the past to national narratives of sovereignty and citizenship. Despite its centrality to major questions of the discipline, scholars inside and outside of the country have neglected its lessons. In his signal contribution, Michel Roth-Triot chose the island specifically to demonstrate the, quote, many ways in which the production of historical narratives involves an uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means of such production, end quote. Teaching at an HBCU to students whose history has almost always been sidelined in their primary and secondary classrooms, this is both a challenging, crucial, and revelatory proposition. For those of us steeped in such questions of silencing, Triot's example should be both foundational and an opportunity to see how Hispaniola shapes the very questions that drive us as scholars. They are, in fact, the set of concerns that Garcia Peña pushes on and beyond to place Hispaniola at the very epicenter of the frequent, persistent, and exclusionary acts of national narration. Second, I believe that the incorporation of marginalized voices that the first intervention makes illustrate a second crucial contribution to the study of the Dominican Republic, that of broadening the borders of belonging to incorporate a greater range of lived experiences. And this is particularly pointed out by Ginnetta right before me. Across both the 19th and 20th centuries in the Dominican Republic, so the solidifying voices around an elite paternalist version of the national past facilitated a marginalization of women and Afro-descended populations. And yet, as we know, such voices were far from silent in national debates about the present and the future. Moreover, across the 20th century, both Haiti and the Dominican Republic are often categorized as exceptions or abnormalities in humanistic study, given particularly their long periods of US occupation and extended violent dictatorships. Yet looking through the methodological lens of Garcia Peña's work, as well as the flourishing fields of Dominican and Haitian studies, demonstrates an intellectual arena rife with examples of the processes of marginalization and their resistors, as well as the further silencing acts of archive creation and archive retrieval in the historical process. In the 20th century, discussions of citizenship, particularly how certain voices were excluded at the moment and past it, Hispaniola presents a model of incredible value to both understanding the historical processes of silencing, but also the narrative repairs necessary to create a more inclusive national story. Third, the very contours of the Dominican diaspora illustrate, as Garcia Peña shows, a much more complex construction of the quote-unquote immigrant experience, if such a thing can even be bracketed intellectually. Talking back to history from an expansive diaspora occupies a significant portion of the scholarly literature on Hispaniola with good reason. Particularly across the second half of the 20th century, the narratives of both the Dominican Republic and Haiti have been dominated by discussion of migration and identity across borders. As recent scholarship has argued, Hispaniola stands at the very center of the impact that migratory patterns have had on receiving nation states, particularly the United States, whether that be cross-island or cross-Atlantic, and they are hardly all stories of loss, right? Here again, Hispaniola demonstrates that it is the seemingly quote unquote exceptional nature of the island that makes it in fact the ideal example for understanding larger patterns of migration, diaspora, and bordering practices when set within the appropriate historical and historiographical context. Finally, I believe the way that Garcia Peña's work reimagines boundaries, borders, and the act of bordering, and demands a rethinking of the boundaries of Latinidad to fully incorporate Dominicanidad is crucial to the future of the historical field and other fields. It is here that her concept of contradiction becomes most powerful. We talk about how borders are, of course, the lines that separate imaginary communities and race and nationality as social constructs, but the ways Garcia Peña frames her work allow us to think about how people who contend with these lines daily can be architects of reimagining and talking back to those artifices. This is in part constructing an in-between, nier, but also finding ways to challenge the very realities of those boundaries through art and activism and active contestations of the words used to inscribe bodies within racial and national categories. I believe these 4 areas point to the future of a globalized understanding of Dominican and Haitian identity, of Dominican, Haitian, ethnic, and diasporic studies, and of integrating those historical and historiographical ideas far past the island. For me, Garcia Peña's work as a scholar, as a teacher and mentor, as an activist, as a friend, do not just move beyond insular and parochial understandings of Hispaniola or the Caribbean more broadly, because her work never assumes them as a reality. Her work brings the place and its people into long-running conversations, dialogues, and in her words, dictions about borders and bordering, about Latinidad and diaspora, and about Blackness that are critical historical interventions. She is not content to shout that Hispaniola belongs in the canon. Her work aims at something much more valuable, and of which we need a constant reminder, that the so-called canon doesn't even exist without it. Beyond all this, however, Lourdes Garcia Peña's work demonstrates through pedagogy and activism that those scholarly interventions truly mean something on the ground. It reminds us that we can and should be activists, that as scholars, we can say and do things that make a real difference, whether that is physically occupying space on Harvard Yard, as she did with her students, building Freedom University, or generally creating theoretical spaces for inclusion and belonging. As she writes of a performance, she analyzes the work, quote, dares us to dream about the possibility of hope through solidarity and interdependency of people working together, end quote. All of her labor does this work and is grounded in her vision of a better and more inclusive and fair future. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Beth. We have only a few minutes left. The session is recorded, and so I encourage everyone to revisit what's been said today. And if you have questions, direct them to us at our institutions. I know I'm not speaking just for myself when I express my deep gratitude for the presented here by Professor Torres, Professor Briggs, Professor Candelario, and Professor Manley. I feel energized, enlightened, inspired by what they have to say, because I think what they expose is that we're not supplicants asking for a place at the table, but we're showing the way in which the table has been fatally constructed to the detriment of knowledge, to the detriment of social justice, to the detriment of freedom-loving people all around the world. When we talk about the margins and the center, moving from the footnote to the center of the page, or from the periphery to the metropolis, we're not hobbyists or antiquarians seeking to add on some extraneous knowledge. We're actually revealing how systems work, and we're also exposing the arbitrary, artificial, and irrational exclusions that make up the dominant university. You don't fire Lourdes Garcia Peña because she isn't good. You fire her because she's so good, your whole apparatus will fall apart if people start asking the kinds of questions that she asks. And so what we have here is a project in which we can move along, and their attempts to suppress us only backfire, only produce the opposite of what they're intended to do. There's a plant called the Spanish nettle, and many people think it's a weed. It goes into all sorts of places. It lives on what Lourdes Garcia Peña calls the vaivén, the back and forth, the to and fro. And the only way to kill the Spanish nettle is to pull it out of the ground. But when you pull it out of the ground, you spread its seeds to 100 different places. And so the injury that was done by Harvard, the injury that's done by Yale and Dartmouth and all these other institutions, in some ways you have to feel sorry for them. If they had arguments to refute what we have to say, they would mobilize them. But because they don't have them, they have to sneer. But we're used to that. We come from populations that have been discounted and disregarded for centuries, and we're still here. We're going to continue to be here. As the great Willie Ricks, the SNCC organizer, used to say, if we stay on the path, we'll see each other down the road. So thanks to the panelists, thanks to those participating, thanks to Professor Fuentes-Mayorga, to the DSA, and we'll see you all down the road.
Thank you. Oh, I invite you. This was fantastic. Thank you. I've never had a panel like this in my 15 years in academia. So this is wonderful. And I too lost tenure. So it hit a chord in my heart, right? As a Dominican, not a Dominican that gets, harpooned. And so it's taken me a while, right, to come back. But thank you. This is history, and my daughters will listen to this. I will make sure they do. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. I welcome you to the reception this afternoon, virtual reception this afternoon. Okay.
Gracias.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.